Can Asia keep growing without changing? What if China's growth falters? How do we turn Asia's challenges into the world's opportunities? Introducing Dr. Victor Fung, founding chairman of Fung Global Institute.
How are you? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to take your seats and we can get the session started? Okay. Can we get started? Please. All right, I'm sure you had a very active session just beforehand. So let me now start this session, which is Asia's Rebalancing Act, an opportunity for global business. We're really here to get some really global business views on what is happening in Asia and how global business can take advantage of some of the opportunities in Asia. I have a very distinguished panel, Mr. Rahmi Koç from Turkey. I will introduce him in a little more detail when he speaks. Mr. Sam Palmisano from the US, and Mr. Kevin Walsh also from the US. So with your permission, I'm going to ask our panelists to make their opening comments, and then we will begin our session. Then after that, we will have a discussion, quick discussion among ourselves. Then of course, I will then open up to all of you to see if you have any questions you'd like to address to the panel members. So our first speaker, I'd like to invite Mr. Rahmi Koç. Mr. Koç is the honorary chairman of the Koç Group. I cannot think of a more visionary business leader and philanthropist from Turkey and that whole region. He has not only, with his family, not only built the Koç Group into an amazing enterprise that is almost taking up 10% of the GDP of Turkey, but he has also done a tremendous amount in terms of philanthropy, public service, building hospitals, universities, museums, and so on. So, Mr. Koç,
thank you, Victor. You must be tired. Now you're going to eat. Some of you might fall asleep, so if you bear with us for another few minutes, we'll be very happy. 3 years ago, I asked Victor whether he would be the commencement speaker of the Koç University in Istanbul, and he kindly accepted it. He came to Istanbul and made a very interesting speech, and then he gave a strong, resounding message to the young men and women in the audience, the graduates, the parents, and the faculty. And he said, if you want to be successful, go east. I don't know whether his finger was pointing to east or west, but I took his suggestion as face value, and here I am today. It's an honor for me to address the Asian Global Dialogue. I want to start by thanking Victor, William, and the Fung Global Institute for putting together this remarkable conference. Over the years, Victor and I have shared a common vision to preserve an open trade regime and broaden the global exchange for the future. We have worked together for this cause at the International Chamber of Commerce. Then we continued this dialogue through our institutions, I with the Global Relations Forum, GRF we call it, and he with the FUN Global Institute, FGI, where we are here today. I believe that GRF has one key advantage over FGI, because Istanbul straddles two continents. We are in a position to offer both European and Asian perspectives on global issues. Victor and I both believe passionately in an open, integrated world where goods, services, labor, and capital, but most importantly, ideas move freely across borders. I have asked Victor to sit on our board, and he kindly accepted it. Now we benefit not only from our European and American members, but from Victor's vast experience and wisdom as well. For me, global integration matters. It has many layers. It requires constant effort and needs institutions. On that note, we are fortunate to have like-minded friends at both ends of Asia. I was once invited to conduct a philharmonic orchestra in Istanbul. I was overwhelmed by the difficulty of making each instrument blend and each note sound in accord. Today, the rebalancing of the world is more challenging, delicate and difficult than before. We need to harmonize discords in the complex process of global integration. If we fail, none of us will hear the music of the global orchestra, as everyone will revert to playing their own tunes on their own national instruments. As we heard from Victor and Stuart this morning, the news from Bali on the Doha round is not encouraging. We simply have to make progress on this. A healthier management of the global financial system is a must. The IMF should assume a more active role, and the G20 members have to come to an understanding of the needs of today's world. But the problem is that the international institutions and interfaces are not enough for the global orchestra to perform seamlessly. We need each nation to function properly as well. Global mechanisms will fail if the US politics are at a deadlock, the EU cannot manage the euro, and China cannot transition to a new economic model. Similarly, it is impossible to have a well-functioning global system if the liberal markets, rule of law, and freedom of expression are not efficient in the nation states, while the gap between rich and poor widens and unemployment rises. Societies have difficulties when they have to change their lifestyles. Europeans do not want to give up their welfare states. Americans do not want to consume less, and I suspect Asians do not want to give up their high growth rates. In Europe, they have to get their national balance sheets in order, including the state and the financial sector. Countries cannot be as generous as they have been in the past. The role of state in European societies has to change. The problem is that the burden of this adjustment falls unevenly between the North and the South because of the euro. Our European friends have to decide soon whether they want to compete in the world together with a single currency, or if they want to go their separate ways. Americans have to have high consumption rates and therefore low savings. The governments cannot continue to create asset bubbles to keep the system going. But I think we know now that it is not a safe and sustainable policy. As the US gets out of the crisis and returns to normal, it will have to achieve a steady higher savings rate. Otherwise, the current account deficit and increasing external liabilities will widen. Finally, in China, the inevitable transformation seems to be the shift from an export-driven growth model to internally driven growth. But when you change gears, economic growth might decline. Needless to say, the Chinese leadership has an exceptional track record in economic management. They have just announced a carefully crafted set of reforms and adjustments intended to take root over the next 10 years. I'm of the opinion that they will handle the transition with minimum damage. However, a new lower growth trajectory may be inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, within the context of this global rebalancing, I will share with you the journey of the largest and fastest growing economy in the Middle East and Central Asia. Turkey's economy is thriving in a dangerous neighborhood despite the lack of natural resources. Our successful transformation within the last decade started with a severe crisis in 2001 that was triggered by problems in the banking sector and public finances. It was very similar to the situation in the troubled euro area today. At the time, Turkey spent $60 billion to fix its banking sector when its total GDP was only $150 billion. I'm sure you will agree that it was a very expensive remedy. This courageous decision cost the then three-party coalition government the next elections in 2002. And I think all of them couldn't get over the 10% barrier of elections. Since then, GDP per capita has increased from $3,000 to $11,000 this year. Thanks to an uninterrupted focus on maintaining fiscal discipline, Turkey's budget deficit to GDP ratio declined from 12% in 2001 to an estimated 1% this year. In 2011, the share of public debt to the GDP was 78%. Today, it has come down to 36% and is expected to converge to 30% within the next couple of years. As a result, the inflation rate came down from almost 70% to 7.7% in less than 12 years. Economically, our dependence on Europe has reduced significantly. For instance, the share of EU in Turkey's exports was as high as 60% in 2004, and it came down to 40% in 2012, while the share of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia increased substantially. Today, in a modern reenactment of the Silk Road, Turkish construction companies are second only to the Chinese in their reach with their global contracting portfolio. Turkish airlines fly to more countries than any other airline, and Turkish businessmen are traveling throughout the world, expanding their horizons. On the 90th anniversary of our Independence Day, the world's first intercontinental tunnel was inaugurated in Istanbul, under the Bosphorus Straits. Now, you can travel from Shanghai to London by train. We have targeted to become one of the 10 largest economies in the coming decade. In order to do this, we have to change our economic model. We will have to enter new emerging markets, especially in Asia, and multiply our value-added exports. A lot will fall on the shoulders of the private sector. Investments in innovation and R&D will have to increase, and our companies will have to accelerate the pace of internationalization. There are, of course, many challenges ahead. Turkey's private sector debt levels, current account deficit, and low saving rates are its Achilles heel. Like I said, this situation needs immediate action by transforming direct greenfield investments to value-added exports. Dear friends, as I mentioned before, Istanbul is the only city in the world that sits on 2 continents. I want to leave you with the thought that we are as much of a bridge from the west to the east as we are from the east to the west, and we are as much Asian as we are European. Turkey must capitalize on this strategic position if we are to reach our goal and contribute to global rebalancing. At the end of the day, the world is an orchestra, and we need to play the same music to adhere to our common objective. We all have national agendas, but if we don't hang together, we will have to hang separately. We, the Turks, have originated from Central Asia and from there spread out to the west. Now it is time to head back east. I would like to thank the FUN Global Institute for giving us the opportunity to talk about our plans to interact and play tunes in harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remy, for those very, very perceptive comments. I like especially the last part. We want to reclaim you for Asia. You are definitely a part of Asia in our minds. Next, I think we have another visionary global leader with us. Mr. Sam Palmisano was the chairman and CEO of IBM. And under his tutelage, the entire IBM was transformed. And I think the transformation, in my mind, was absolutely a storybook, a case study for all of us who are interested in building global businesses to look at. And I've certainly benefited greatly from interactions with Sam over the years. Sam today is chairman of the Center for Global Enterprises, setting up, really some of the things that companies can do in the road to globalization that they could share on a non-profit basis. And as Sam characterized it, all the things that they had hoped to do and seek counsel that they were not able to do while they were chief executives of companies, that he hoped that something like the Center for Global Enterprises can actually take the place of. So with that, Sam,
thank you.
You have the podium.
Victor, thank you for that kind introduction. It's very, very generous. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here today. I must admit, when I was CEO for about 10 years and CEO for 2, I was never invited to speak at a prestigious think tank. Perhaps it's the nature of your job. No one thinks any American CEO has that much thought to provide. So I'm here today as your luncheon speaker. So I'll provide entertainment if no intellectual content will be leave my lips. But actually, Victor asked me to comment on the nature of global competition and our views of global competition and where we see the world headed from the perspective of a guy who spent 40 years running a mid-sized company in 170 countries with 500,000 employees. So I'll give it a shot. Basically, most people think about the world today and competition. I'll describe it, what is not. What isn't it? Well, it's no longer constrained by physical distance. It's no longer confined or limited by man-made barriers of language, customs, or protocols. It's no longer confined to proprietary systems, and it's no longer constrained by national borders. So we know what it's not, but we don't really know what it is. And that is the challenge. And I think we heard from a lot of the panelists this morning, and a lot of what you see in this intellectual endeavor, like the Fung Institute, is what is it, and then how do you participate in this thing that is to be defined? To me, anyway, it was easier for me to come up with a point of view of what it is by trying to understand what happened over the past 30 years and to look back. And if you look back at what happened over the past 30 years, the world's economies have been shaped by four major shifts. It was an embrace of open markets and open trade, striking rebalancing of global political influence. We heard a lot about that this morning, especially the role of Asia. The use of economic growth as a basis for national competition. Clearly, we see that in the contention over natural resources and currency flows. And of course, not to be left out, the digital networked revolution, which we heard a lot about at dinner. A statistic, today, which is often used, there are 2.7 billion people on the internet. It's 40% of the world's population. We heard about the phenomenal acceleration in China in the adoption of, because of mobile technology, and I will call the impact on personal lifestyle based on mobile technology, commerce, payment systems, media, entertainment, and the like. There was an observation that I would share with you that I made with the chief executive of Hong Kong last night. Every emerging country skips a generation of technology. And it's bigger here because everything is big in China. But it's no different than what's happened in the past, my 50 years in technology. Everyone will jump to if they have the wherewithal to do so. It's just the scale is quite honestly the difference in this part of the world versus some of the other countries. But something that's not known as well as that is there are over 1 trillion interconnected devices today on the internet. It's called the Internet of Things. It's things you would never associate as a computer. There are more than 1 billion transistors for every human being on the face of the earth. All are basically computers in today's environment. They're giving off vast amounts of information, which now people call big data. And Victor's asked me to comment about big data. I might do that in the Q&A. But it's a huge opportunity because this vast amount of information is available to be analyzed and acted upon in almost real time by computers that today you don't program. They're cognitive. They learn, like the machine that IBM developed that competed for the American game show Jeopardy and won against 3 of the masters, the best ever to play the game. The Watson machine learns and it adjusts throughout the Q&A period. So clearly, the world's playing field has changed. It's been infused with data and intelligence. The door is opened. I think it's a wonderful thing that the door is opened. And as that door opened, over 500 million people around the world have entered the middle class. And as they've entered the middle class, it's created great economic opportunities. And in many ways, stability as a result of people migrating into this new middle class. But that's kind of where we find ourselves today. It created enormous investment opportunities. We saw the movement of goods and manufacturing go throughout the globe. We saw the movement of jobs, the movement of money flows where there's opportunity, which we refer to as that resources and capability will always flow to the point of quality and low cost, regardless of political persuasion. And that's what's happened, regardless of political persuasion. Now, our planet runs today on global supply chains. No one knows that better than Li and Fung. And so it's hard to characterize, as we heard from Mike Spence this morning, what is an import or what is an export? It's hard to imagine when so many things come from so many places in the world, what is a finished good? There is no more offshoring when there is no shore. There's no longer outsourcing when there is no out. There's no such thing any longer as the world has continued to globally integrate. So this single regime, everyone had the perception that it would become a nice, linear, smooth progression, right? It would continue to evolve and life would be grand. That was the case until the financial crisis. And then since then, everything has been sort of turned up and down, and people are reflecting as to where we are. Is global integration, is it over? Is this regionalization occurring within the financial system? Will that constrain it and stop it? Will some articulate politician that reads well from a teleprompter slow down the progress that's been made over the past 30 years? I disagree. I think that is completely wrong, and I'm going to make the case that the fun is about to begin. And it's time to rethink, because the nature of competition is going to change dramatically, and to anyone who has been competing in whatever walk of life you're in, this is when the excitement begins. And for many different reasons. One is, I'll refer to as the easy path to per capita income relative to GDP growth is over. It's happened. It occurred. China was the manufacturing hub of the world. India was the software services hub of the world. That's happened. It's occurred. It's not going to happen again. That, in many ways, I would refer to as Global Integration Act 1. But now the game is completely different. You know, the world is, the expectations have changed. Regulations and standards are viewed differently. Higher expectations of product quality exist today. Service must be a higher quality today. Intellectual property is more important. Rule of law matters in this environment. And everyone's waking up to the fact that rule of law matters. Notice I said higher. I didn't say lower. To succeed in this new global economy, you need to take your game to a new level. Now, as that was going on in the developing world, unfortunately, in the developed world, we were creating massive deficits, not just fiscal deficits. We created deficits in the areas of knowledge and learning and competitiveness. We created deficits in the areas of infrastructure and their competitiveness. Everything is rusting and aging. Our education systems aren't up to speed. Our governments are behind the trends. So we have these massive deficits that now exist in the developed world. But as these forces come together, there is the middle income trap, which we heard about, for the developing world, i.e. the solution becomes innovation. The inherent advantage in innovation is the developed world, where they have the infrastructure, the schools, and the nature, but they have to deal with these constraints, these deficits that were in many ways self-imposed by themselves. And we've heard a lot of discussion today about the importance of austerity in the EU, Abenomics in Japan, political division in the United States. Just all of the emerging markets are now being hit. They are being hit at the same time with the middle income trap. The world also finds itself, the developed world, with these huge structural overhangs. So many people refer to this as structural overhangs versus the middle income trap. I mean, since I was never very good in academic situations, I kind of think of it as it's a sci-fi movie. You know, it's like Star Wars 8 or something, you know. Think of it, structural overhangs versus the middle income trap. Who will win in this battle of the titans? I really think that the winners are going to be either the enterprises or the societies that play the new game, that don't cling to the past, that move to the future and play the game, play an offensive game, not a defensive game, which is why in my retirement, we created this nonprofit, which Victor alluded to, called the Center for Global Enterprises, which is more kind of the corporate view of what is that new game. But I believe that the new game is going to be played around three principles. I don't care who you are or how big you are, you better have something of unique value. Because if you don't have something of unique value, you will be commoditized faster than you ever imagined. There is no barrier of entry today. Kevin and I were out in the Silicon Valley a couple of weeks ago, and the VCs were reacting to the point that in the old days they could create whatever. And in a few years they'd be mostly in the United States, maybe some English-speaking countries in North America or Europe. And then they'd go public, and then they'd worry about expanding their opportunities perhaps to Asia. Today they say when they're in the first round of financing, their business is already being copied in China. All the things we heard about last night. There is no time. It is immediate. And the view of the Chinese, according to the VCs in the US, is that they don't know if these guys are right or wrong, but if they're right half the time, they're better probably than they are at it since they've never done it before. So they just copy it immediately, and they create all these wonderful companies, and they scale them dramatically. So you have to have something of unique value. That's the most important thing. As I say, without that, what would cause anything to flow to you? If you're a society, why would anything flow to you? Investment, people, or skills? Why, if you have nothing of unique value that you can provide to them? If you were a company, why would somebody do business with you if you can't provide something unique and of value to them? So what is that unique value? Secondarily, I'd say that every enterprise, every society must simultaneously invest in the future and invest in the future and improve its competitive muscle tone. Now, this is, to me, where it's a false choice between investment and austerity. There is no such thing as investment and austerity. Of course, one must deal with these fiscal imbalances that's been created in the developed world, but that's called reallocation of resources. I mean, that's what you do every day in the corporate sense. You reallocate resource, capital, or people to future opportunity. Geographic mix, portfolio shifts of IBM, divesting your PC business. That's what you do. But you have to have a point of view of the future. Your point of view can't be the 17th century and allocate resources to something that was the first industrial revolution and wonder why you're frustrated with the pace of change. So you must have a point of view of what the future is and allocate to be successful in that environment. And thirdly, there's, I'll argue, the potential of big data. And by big data, it's really more than just social media. Big data has the potential to change everything systemically in how society conducts itself, how the world could be a more sustainable place, as well as exactly how businesses can run themselves and manage their systems. Let's give you some example of what I would talk about when we talk about big data. Think about 3D manufacturing. The impact of 3D manufacturing. It's not just about computerized manufacturing and intelligence and the ability to have these custom parts be actually printed at the end of the manufacturing line and the like and be assembled. Just think about the impact of that technology on the world's manufacturing center, which has basically mostly been a labor-based model. This is a hugely transformational technology. Think about energy. Think about what's occurred as the U.S. now is the largest energy exporter when you take oil, liquids and gas combined in just a short period of time because of horizontal fracking. Again, technology. The only inhibitor to reducing the oil dependency or the cost of energy if you're in a manufacturing facility in the United States is public policy. It's not technology. It's public policy. The technology is there, and it's there to transform the economic model and the geopolitical structure of many societies if it would be allowed to progress. And I could go on and on. But clearly, the way to the future is an innovation-driven model. Now, what I'd say is that it's easy to watch the evening news in despair and dwell on national leadership because of whether it's the political divide that's talked a lot about in my home country or lack of a thorough plan in many other countries, with the exception of China. That's easy to do. Except I think, and I have an opinion, if you look beyond the surface, if you look below the surface, you're going to see great things going on. You see great provincial leaders doing incredible things. You see like Mayor Paes in Rio de Janeiro, what he's done to improve the quality of life and the safety of his city. You'll see things that corporate leaders are doing to make their companies smarter, or IBM, more sustainable. There are incredible things going on around the world, but it's being done by pragmatic people. It's not based on ideology. It's based on a premise that at the end of the day, if you're a mayor, if you're a governor, if you're a corporate leader, or you're whomever you happen to be, and that you touch someone's life, you have a role and responsibility to improve it, not a role and responsibility to depress people by telling them how bad their existence is. And that's what's happening, which to me gives me great optimism. So this is why in my next endeavor, I'm going to kind of join Victor. No one will call our center a think tank, I don't think, Victor. We will never be able to assemble the brain power that you've been able to assemble because most of my colleagues and I didn't go to school together, which I've learned here. You know, how you got invited, you went to school with Victor. You know, MIT, Harvard, if your children went to St. Paul's, you're here, you know, right? Since I didn't share that same academic experience because I wasn't qualified, we're going to come at it more from a pragmatic point of view, which is to do research on how to help companies deal with this world as we see it. But seriously, Victor, my good friend, thank you for having me. I am honored to be with such a wonderful audience here in Hong Kong.
Sam, that was terrific. I still need to pursue you later about big data. Okay. You know, that's something of great interest to me. But you know, really thank you for that. Thank you for your visionary leadership. You know, I think all of us would very much look forward to what the Center for Global Enterprises will be doing in the future and how we can participate. Okay, last but not least, I turn to Kevin Walsh. Kevin is a board director of the Center for Global Enterprises, but very importantly, Kevin was a board member of the Fed between the years 2006 to 2011. In fact, Kevin was responsible as an operating governor, you called it? Or the... You basically, Kevin ran all the operations of the Fed, was responsible for the running of the Fed for a number of years. But what intrigued me a lot also is that he actually, on behalf of the Fed, was the emissary to many countries representing the Fed's point of view, and especially here in Asia. So, Kevin, I'd like to give you the floor.
Victor, thank you very much. It's great to be here. You might ask yourself, what is a retired central banker doing on a panel with these great statesmen, entrepreneurs, innovators, business leaders? And I think that probably speaks to the nature of the times we're in. Before the financial crisis, you would no longer find a central banker with these titans on a stage as you would today. And I will venture a guess that when we meet at a Fung Global Institute meeting some years from now and the global economy is back to its true potential, central bankers will be separated on a panel, and Stan Fisher and I and others will be talking about what we do. But the focus will be back on the micro foundations of the economy. Until then, we central bankers have somehow tried to find our way onto center stage. So with that, I appreciate being here. It's an honor to do just that. Let me talk about 5 themes over the course of perhaps the next 10 minutes or so before we get into Q&A. And the first one is what I referenced at the outset. Macro is dominating micro. The world of macroeconomic policies, central banks, prudential supervision, the conduct of meetings in Basel, the preference for how to treat banks and bank regulation, the new financial architecture. This is what's preoccupying not just government officials, but real businesses and real entrepreneurs on the front lines of the economy. And as I'd suggest, I would say while macroeconomic policy is surely important, while as Mike Spence said this morning, macroeconomic policies matter a lot to the underlying reality of these economies, macroeconomic policies have to some degree, in my view, crowded out the micro foundations of the economy that will dictate whether the next 10 and 20 years is a great one for this region and the world or isn't. It won't be because central bankers have applied just the right medicine in just the right way. It won't be because of new triumphs from central banker meetings in Basel, Switzerland. It'll be because we haven't done harm to the micro foundations of the economy. This doesn't mean that central banks don't matter. It doesn't mean that macroeconomic policy doesn't matter. But it does mean we need to put the focus back on the real side of the economy of risk takers and entrepreneurs and business leaders like I'm on stage with. So that's theme 1. Second theme. Well, what about the role of central banks themselves? If you look to the deepest, darkest days of the financial crisis, what you'll find is that central bankers looked around and found they had to take extraordinary actions to get the economy to reset, to get financial markets to open, to get prices to clear. And if you go back to the founding of institutions like the Federal Reserve that's coming upon its 100th anniversary, you see that the response to financial panics is what central bankers were built and designed to do. So the aggressiveness in crisis times, in my view and the view of many of my colleagues both in the US and around the world, were times that central bankers had to step up, had to try to respond to the crisis. But we'd be making a grave mistake if we thought in central bank land that we could continue to pull rabbits out of the hat. That the difference in economic growth over the next 12 months of global GDP going from 3% where it's running to 4.5% or 5% where it should be is largely in the hands of central bankers. Central bankers have had a unique opportunity to be aggressive in the crisis, to work collaboratively and collectively across regions and across countries to respond to the depths of the crisis. But that should not be confused with our ability to drive an economic situation like we find ourselves in. There's a great deal of preoccupation today by people in this room and investors around the world about Fed policies. Will the Fed taper when it meets in a couple of weeks? What will the asset purchases look like in 2014? That preoccupation with Fed policy, both in the US and around the world, strikes me as quite counterproductive to where the preoccupation should be on the underlying fundamentals of what make good economies great. Cultures of success and failure, hard work, the ethic of education, the respect for rule of law, the need to work across borders, as Victor and Sam and others have spoken about. But here we find central bankers that have found their way to the front pages of the newspapers, now going on 5 or 6 years. And I would suggest that the global economy will not come roaring back until you find central bankers again. But this time they'll be on section C of the newspaper, maybe page 10. Well, there'll be a small article in 6 paragraphs that says what the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or the Bank of Japan did as they met over the course of the last day or two. It's not obvious to me that this macroeconomic and central banker impetus at this point in time in this environment is the difference between strong and effective growth that takes the next generation out of poverty and brings them into the middle class, as many would have us believe. Central banks, at the end of the day, what we can do is help buy time. Buy time for the rest of the political actors to get engaged. Buy time for the real economy to find itself. But as we endeavor upon these sorts of policies going into year 5, 6, and 7, central bankers need to ask themselves what investors already are. Is the aggressive actions of central banks buying time, or is it actually collapsing time? Are we creating windows of opportunity for the fiscal authorities and trade authorities and regulatory authorities to set their new set of rules and stand off the stage? Or are we allowing those policies to be crowded out by great liquidity to asset markets that move asset prices, so that most investors are asking themselves not what are the fundamental earnings of the Fortune 500, not what is the cash flow of the next great company coming out of Asia, but instead they're preoccupied with how much longer the Federal Reserve and our central bank colleagues around the world will be taking policies X, Y, and Z. Again, it's not to dismiss the role of central banks, but I do think it's to suggest that they have an important place and role defined. And the question for them and for all of us is what will be their role over time? What will be their responsibility? And in any fight that happens to come between central banks and financial markets, to ask ourselves who's going to prevail in that battle. Third theme, very quickly, about globalization. We talk at conferences like this about the great successes of globalization. Sam took a company and really took full advantage of the globalization wave to provide products and services and technologies to new companies and new countries so that they can do to their economy what the US and so many others had done to ours. But if you looked at the tea leaves, if you looked at capital flows and trade flows, if you looked at financial institutions over the course of the last several years, what economists would say is we're seeing a troubling return to home country bias. Banks are being forced to make decisions about whether to re-domicile. Banks and capital flows and trade flows are going back to where these companies and businesses and financial institutions found themselves some years ago. And the financial architecture, the regulatory limbo, the changing rules as time goes on and conflicting regulations have pushed many of these flows so that if you were only reading the most recent chapter, you wouldn't be talking about globalization. At August meetings like this, you'd be talking about threats to it. You'd be talking about risks to globalization. You'd be talking about a re-regionalization of economies, which we should all know and believe with every bit of our economic history is growth defeating not just for the global economy, but for our individual economies alone. So like many of you, I'm a big believer and optimist that the globalization wave will be the wave that will mark the next 20 years. But as we look around, we should take these threats seriously. Fourth theme, based on this view of macroeconomic policy. Policy is contagious, good policy and bad. And as we meet in groups like this with business officials and ex-government officials, we've got to try to figure out how to best articulate what we know of as the first principles of good economic growth. If we believe in free trade and open borders, if we believe in the fair migration of people to opportunity, then those who have shied away from the government offices and government corridors are going to have to give new voice to a trade agenda that we've talked about before that makes it very clear that the trade negotiations in Bali or anywhere else are not zero-sum game, but that the trade agenda is critical to global economic growth, where there are no net losers, where the global economy and individual countries with respect for the rule of law can win and prevail and make their own citizenry in that much better shape. And so let me end with the fifth and final theme. And that's that real businesses in 2013 going into 2014 and independent think tanks like Victor's here, like Sam's new Center for Global Enterprise, are going to have to play a leading role. Business leaders, entrepreneurs are going to have to stand up for what they believe is right, that their businesses just need a clear set of rules and they can prosper. That real businesses are going to have to take back microphones from government officials, put the focus back on the micro foundations of the macro economy, and then and only then will we find that the global economy can be much stronger than the recent talk of malaise, much more robust than what we hear about of the new normal. There's a new chatter in Washington at the IMF and World Bank that maybe the global economy can't do what we'd long promised. Maybe what we should do is lower our standards. Maybe we should think that the next decade or two is one where global economic growth will be lower, and we should set our expectations to a new horizon. My judgment about the global economy, my judgment about what we see in trends of productivity, not just in recent years, but what we know about what makes economies great, is we need to raise our horizons once again. The U.S. economy is plenty capable of growing well beyond the 2% growth that we have suffered over the last several years. The global economy is way more capable than 3%. Global trade is far more capable than 4.5%. And it will take a robust discussion from business leaders and government officials to realize that the micro foundations of the economy are as strong as ever. And so I only hope, Victor, when this group meets again 12 months from now, we'll have some data behind that optimism to say that the 12 months in front of us then will be still better. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Good job, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, for that very thoughtful and inspirational speech. I must say, several of your themes really resonate. You know what we do in the business world today? We're talking constantly about policy risks. That's a big deal now. In fact, one of the sessions this afternoon is talk about the impact of policy risk. That's exactly what you have just described. And I really like this idea of returning to the micro. Instead of looking at aggregate data and making sweeping statements about the world and where we should be turning, we're really looking at the underpinnings of the global supply chains, the micro enterprises, and then really getting insight on what really is happening. So thank you for that. Thank you. So now I think we have a chance to turn to our very distinguished panel. You know, we're here to look at Asia's Rebalancing Act, okay, and then the opportunities for global business. I must say, for me, one of the biggest issues that people are now having in their minds about Asia is really, one of the hottest issues really is whether China can really find its way and escape this middle income trap. China is now approaching the 10,000 US dollar per capita income. Things have been going very well. Is it going to continue to go and beyond the level of 10 or 12,000, depending on how you want to define it? Can the growth rate continue? Certainly, I think the leaders are now putting a lot of things in place with the third plenum that have just taken place. But do you feel that China will make it? Right, me?
I think
I'll start
China,
with you.
I think China has reached a level when they have to start changing their lifestyle and the management. You need more democracy. You need the rule of law, stronger judiciary, more liberal economy, human rights, direct investments, more, and more R&D, and accountability of the government, and finally, land rights. In short, this is more market and less government. And China's biggest challenge will be how to manage the democratic society and how to carry that burden. I asked Ratan Tata one day, I said, look here, Ratan, China has got 4-lane asphalts, roads, and highways, and road structure in India is awful. We can't get from one place to another without flying. And he said, we have democracy. I said, what do you mean? He said, when we want to confiscate land, the owner goes to the higher court and stops it. Whereas in China, they take the map, they draw a line, and the road is made there. So that's the difference. So this lifestyle must change, and I'm sure it will change, and they will manage. They've managed so far with the system you have, and they will manage with the system that's going to be adopted from now on. Russia made a mistake of democracy first, liberal economy second. China did not make that mistake. They said liberal economy first, democracy later on. I think that time has come. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi, for that. I must say, if that's what you feel, I think the reforms that I'm seeing is absolutely heading in that direction. You know, I think what we've seen out of the third plenum is the whole idea of the efficacy of the market as the mechanism for allocating resources.
Yeah.
And then with the development of the internet, you know, the liberalization, the freeing up, I think will come as a matter of course. But I think it's a long road though, and I think there's a lot that we need to do in the meantime.
You have a 10-year program now, and I'm sure you'll, at the end of 10 years, reach what you have designed and planned. And this new system will help your SMEs better. I think they'll enter more markets and more places, and they will become more efficient and bigger.
Yep.
And this will bring up the whole Chinese economy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know what our other
Sam,
friends
what do you think?
Well, I would completely agree with what everything we've just heard. The question is, and if it's in any transition, whether you're a society or you're a company, that's tricky. If you look at the history of technology companies who've been able to have an Act Two, I can think of two, Apple and IBM. You know, most of them don't make it to an Act Two. It doesn't mean they don't have a great Act One. Phenomenally successful, the PC guys, but now they're all struggling. So, and it's because of the impact that technology has over the business model, the business structure, the same argument as far as the impact technology is going to have over a society. But they're very, very tricky transitions. I mean, usually there's a logical path to the future, but it's the ability to have the leadership to convince your constituency that you're willing to make that change. And that's what is really, really hard. You know, I mean, the analogy of an IBM with China is a joke, obviously, right? You know, I had to convince 500,000 people in 170 countries, not, you know, whatever it is, billions, you know, right, and all these provinces and the like. But you have to be able to convince them that ultimately the fact, if you are a Chinese business, at the end of the day, you're better off competing than being protected. I mean, as I once argued, the best business, the model of all is a monopoly. That is the best pricing power. If you can't get one, then take a duopoly, right? But now, so go to somebody who's had a monopoly or a duopoly and say, guess what? We're going to open up the market and everybody's going to compete, but you're going to be better because you're going to be stronger, more competitive. You can pay like these crazy guys with stock options. You know, won't that be wonderful? That's a complicated thing. So I completely agree with Rami in the strategy. I just think these transitions are hard to come by at the end of the day. I would say that as my observation, having dealt with a lot of governments around the world, the government here is in much better position than a democracy. Because in many ways, they do have more control over an agenda than you have in a split Congress in my home country, for example.
Yeah. Well, you know, Sam, I'm going to now put in my question about big data in this context. You know, you talk to a businessman, anybody, we're hearing a lot about big data, and it's pretty daunting for those of us who haven't been current. And frankly, I would imagine for small and medium-sized enterprises, this is kind of a huge thing that only big companies can afford. Is this a huge tool that big companies could really beat the small companies with and really squeeze them out of the market? Is this a way for small companies to be able to use this to kind of break out and really have an impact on helping countries like China actually go through the middle income track? I'd like you to just give us your thoughts on this impact of big data.
I mean, one of the things I've learned in technology, it is the ultimate levelizer. It levelizes all elements, right? Size gives you no inherent advantage. You know, it's not like you're a huge commodity player where size matters. If you're looking at natural resources or steel, yes, size matters. Return on capital relative to that huge fixed cost infrastructure matters. But when you're writing code on your cell phone connected to some wire someplace, size does nothing for you, okay, right? Okay. At anything, it can be an inhibitor. Now, what is big data? I'm going to take the hype out of big data, okay, right? Because everything in technology gets hyped. So today, it's big data and it's cloud, right? That's the hype. Everything is in a cloud and everything is big data, right? The fact of the matter is, all cloud is a different way to compute. It's a different computing model. You had mainframes, you had PC client server, and now you have a horizontal structure called cloud. That's all it is. It's nothing more than that. And people will evolve to it because it's a better technology at a lower cost point, just like they evolved to everything else. What happens with cloud, because you lower the cost point, things that you couldn't do before, only big companies could afford, supercomputers, everybody can use because you can subscribe. You can subscribe to Baidu, Alibaba, IBM, Google, Amazon, whomever. And you can get the capacity of what only the large scientific laboratories had in the past, and you pay for as you use it. Then take that plus all these devices that you all carry and all those sensors and cameras everywhere in the world, they are all giving off huge amounts of data. Physical data about the environment, traffic, crime, pollutants, what have you. Informational data, how you shop, where you spend, what movies you like or dislike, and all that information, or your logistics of your supply chain. You can model down to the minutest level now in a real-time way because you put sensors everywhere. You can track poultry from the farm to the shelf. You can track tomatoes, whatever you would like, for very inexpensive devices that are pennies. So that's really what it is. It allows you to take these things that occur in the physical world, that heretofore you thought, well, that was what the physical world did. It's not what the IT world dealt with. And it basically gives you a view or a picture into it. That's all it is. Now, you can apply it to do incredible things, i.e. the payment system. You could apply it not only from an electronics payment perspective, but you can also put the marketing and the relationship building on top of the payment system. You could look at your supply chain and you can create value around the services within the supply chain versus just get a box to a point at a point in time. So it creates those business opportunities. But at the end of the day, if you could just think about, it's taking the physical world and make it digital so you can see it, and you can basically see it through the computer lens, and lowering the cost points so everybody can afford it. It really is, it reduces the barriers of entry. I mean, you know, you think about it, in the old days, if we were going to build a big computer system, we had to have a semiconductor facility, we would tie up $2 or $3 billion in capital, right? You could create a social media company on $5 million and 5 smart kids on their cell phones. So the whole world has opened up and changed. And there's no advantage. There's no advantage to the US versus China or to India versus what have you. All it is smart people. The internet infrastructure exists everywhere in the world. It's open data standards now. We'll get into all the technical jargon, but these open data standards, Hadoop, et cetera, make this stuff available so that a layperson can actually analyze it and apply it.
So really, big data basically really opens up the whole market. It's a real leveler and
Yes.
allows very easy, there are no barriers to entry today. And it really, if anything, allows a small guy to participate easier. You don't invest in a huge system anymore. You pay $200 a month or whatever to sign on and pay as you go.
Pay as you go. And then the data sets, a lot of the information on the internet, it's all public and free. Well, which is the good news, it's public and free. It's also the bad news because you have privacy and security issues associated with the fact that it's all open and free. So don't think because you're on your cell phone, you're in a private space.
So Sam, final question. How would something like this huge technological change, impact economy's ability now to really rise and go through this middle income?
I really do believe it's a huge way to create future jobs. And there's going to be entire professions created around this data science. They're called data architects. I mean, even credit card companies now are hiring data scientists, right? Where people have the ability to understand an element of a business, a demographic of a card, or an oncology if you're Sloan Kettering or whatever. So some area of that, and then create the profession around analyzing the data. It's a whole new profession. It's a whole new area for academia to teach people these kinds of analytical skills that doesn't exist today. At the same time, it's going to create completely different business models. And as always, in a new business model creation, if you are the traditional company that had the successful model of the past, there's no guarantee of success in the future. So the new guy can compete with Microsoft. Think about it. You know, Microsoft, Dell, HP, dominant players, Intel, the PC era. They're nowhere in the mobile era. So guys, you know, that basically grew up writing some software, and some guy does a design shop out of the UK that does design, doesn't even manufacture a chip for the phone, are the dominant, they're the winning players in this new world. So I would, you know, it's not that we would plan industrial policy, because that's not how we think about it as Americans. We think about creating an environment where everybody can prosper and let them figure it out. And we have that bias. We don't like help, you know, as you know, Victor. We really aren't looking for help, handouts from our government. Most of us anyway. It's sort of it's the nature of the breed. But put that aside for a second. If you were, you'd lay out incentives that create opportunities for entrepreneurs to take risk capital, to invest that risk capital, and to create these new businesses. And all these businesses are inherently scalable. They can be global day one. Unlike, you know, it took IBM probably, of our 100 years, 60 years to get to probably 80 countries, you know. You could have market access 30, 40 countries immediately in this new world. It's completely changed.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. I mean, I must say, you really contributed to my thought process anyway. The conventional wisdom has sometimes been, technology, technological change, higher productivity destroys jobs. What you're really saying is with this data revolution, big data, maybe jobs could be created.
It creates it's different kinds
different
of
types
jobs,
of jobs.
Right? It's every transition in an economic sense creates a different kind of job. I mean, look, we're not going to create farmers, and that's an easy one to talk about. Even though we have huge farm subsidies all over the world, it's not going to create enough jobs to sustain, get out of the middle income trap with more farms. I know you say that. Nobody argues that, right, Victor? We don't need another farm. And I would argue, as I've argued with the Chinese government, you don't need another manufacturing facility. Right? You think you have enough manufacturing facilities. You should think about the future areas of the economy. But if you're going to participate in the future areas of the economy, as Rami was saying, I'm on innovation-based, then you have to respect worldwide standards for innovation. That's called intellectual property. Right? You can't disrespect innovation-based principles and participate in this segment of the economy. Because money and people won't flow there. They're going to flow someplace else where their ideas can be protected, where they can be monetized, where the risk capital can be rewarded, and that's what happens.
Right. Well, thank you, Sam. This is the perfect segue. Maybe, Kevin, let me move to you and really continue this theme of job creation. Sure. I think one of the things that we're trying to explore in this dialogue, and I think sometimes people talk about, liberalization, all this economic development, we forget it really comes down to jobs, and jobs, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And, really, the impact of technology on jobs, the idea of, if you are actually able to maintain growth, you'll be able to, sort of maintain the jobs. Now, Kevin, let me ask you, you've gone on record to say, and you mentioned it earlier, that, the U.S., for example, needs to create, to grow at 3 and 3.5% to create the type of sustainable jobs. It's growing at about 2%. Right. How do you actually close that gap? And what do you think about sort of the future of job creation as you kind of look out in the global economy?
Sure. So let me build on where Sam took that discussion, Victor. So the only thing that we really do know in economics is that the secret to a long-term economic prosperity for our country is good demographics and great productivity. Demographics is something we can control through our immigration policies, and productivity we can't control very well, but we can stifle. And what Sam just described is an incredible disruptive technology which is productivity enhancing. And I think, Victor, your question is, but how does that find its way to the man on the street? How does that find its way to a new generation of workers who are graduating from universities in the US or in Europe that are finding it a hard place to find work?
Or maybe, Kevin, more controversially, does it help or hurt the man on the street as far as jobs are concerned?
Right, so I'd say at some simple level, there is a race between technology and education is losing. We can either try to stop the race towards technology and say we don't want any more disruptive technologies. Why don't we just slow this whole thing down and bring some stability to our economy? Why don't we take volatility out of financial markets? Why don't we tell the reigning oligopolists in any sector, banking or something else, and say, no more of this competition, it's quite disruptive. It's much more difficult for us to predict what our unemployment rate's going to be next year before our next election. So there's another way to do this instead of stifling technology and innovation, and it's doubling down on education. And I would say, to connect this to the discussion you led with the other day, this morning, Victor, we need to invest in what works. We need to experiment, and ideas matter. If you think about the education movement that started 25 years ago in the US, charter schools, the idea that vouchers might go to some students in urban neighborhoods where they weren't able to get an education. Well, 25 years later, we're starting to see the results. After tons of experimentation, not much of a grand design, we're starting to get real attributes and seeing what works in certain cities. And what we've learned is, if we keep measuring inputs, like how much money are we spending, and we stop measuring outputs like, can the kid read? Is the child able to take this education and go get a job? We're far better off by focusing on outputs. So instead of stifling technology, trying to take volatility out and bring stability to our economy, which sounds great in a financial crisis, but should not sound great to any of us in this room today, by reinvesting in education what works, by taking kids that are able to succeed in this new generation, by giving them the foundation to skills, we know in the US that we can create high productivity economy, higher growth rates, the tune of 3.5%. So instead of being in halls like this where we talk about economic stagnation, we can talk with genuine statistics and genuine confidence. The next generation will be better off. But we need to do that investment. And to this point, I would say the investments in education in the US at least have only been in the early innings of yielding results. And it is perhaps more than anything else a real national priority.
Well, okay, I think that's a tremendous answer, Kevin. You know, the new technology, the increase in productivity actually creates a whole slew of jobs, except it's not the jobs that our current people are trained for.
Yes.
And really, it's a whole idea of mismatch between current skills and the skills you need to do the new jobs that are created. So maybe what we really need is a whole revolution in education.
Yes.
And maybe that's really where some of the attention needs to be focused. I know if you read any of these studies, you know, the World Bank 2030, you know, we're going to add about 1 billion new workers to the global workforce, right, Mike? Over the next 25 years. The issue is not only the question of what do you do with another 1 billion workers, but unfortunately, these 1 billion workers are all unskilled. So therein lies the challenge. Okay, at this point, may I now open up the floor to your questions and see what thoughts you have and what questions you have for our panel members. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Could you please identify yourself first? And
I'm Asif Ibrahim. I'm from Bangladesh, and I am the chairman of Business Initiative Leading Development, a policy reform initiative with the government. Very interesting conversation. I would like to hear the perspective of the panel regarding the future of the economic growth of China, taking into perspectives the old Western consumption model and the new Asian consumption model. What would be the model that China should follow? Also, the environmental, the societal, the social aspect of this growth, whether it would be encompassing the general mass, and in order to do that, what kind of strategies we need to think about going forward.
You're the only economist here, Kevin.
So let me take a shot at that. So if you read through what the new Chinese leadership, the so-called fifth generation, have in mind, I would say the first thing to get this right is you've got to get the diagnosis right. You can't possibly affect the kind of change from an old economic model that, at least in American baseball terms, I would say was in the 7th or 8th inning. You have to decide to understand what ails the economy as a matter of macroeconomic policy, whether it's one-party rule or a political fight in the US. You've then got to decide what are the things that the government can do and what are the things the government needs to stay away from. As Sam suggested, getting that transition right, respect for the rule of law, understanding of intellectual property, allowing small and medium-sized enterprises to have access to credit, ensuring that the kind of migration we've been talking about on trade across borders can also inside of China happen across provinces, make sure that property rights happen, make sure that the social safety net that is being built actually attaches to the individual instead of attaching to the village or the family, such that that worker can find his or her way to their highest and best use. These are the kinds of macroeconomic policies that I would say we should be every bit encouraged about. but turning an economy from an economy that has been credit dependent, that has required more credit for every incremental unit of GDP, the leadership realizes that's a model they have to change. So we might talk in terms of a shadow banking sector in China versus the big 4.5 banks. But fundamentally, credit's got to find its way to the highest best use. So I would add that to the sorts of reforms. The challenge, it strikes me, as they move from that model to a new model, which is a more balanced economy that isn't just export-led and isn't just investment-led, but is more private sector-led, return on invested capital-led. The challenge is going from one model to the other rarely goes in a straight line. And so if the political imperative is to grow above 7%, it is a real challenge to bring that kind of stability to the aggregate data and allow the dynamism at the micro level that is essential for long-term economic growth. If their time horizon is the next 5 to 10 years, that is a good set of obstacles, because then you're solving for the horizon instead of solving for the next quarter if you were a company, or solving for the next year if you were a US politician. But I would say in all likelihood, and Mike Spence made this point this morning, economic growth is likely to, in reality, be somewhat volatile during the transition. The political leadership, the economic leadership, and the existing incumbents among the state-owned enterprises and the banking sector in China have to brace themselves for what will be some intertemporal volatility, what will be some uncertainty as the transition of the model happens. But I'm very encouraged that the leadership seems to recognize that the old model had pretty well played itself out. They had exceeded expectations of many of us, myself included, of what they could accomplish over the course of the last 20 years. But if they weren't going to demand this change themselves, the economy, the politics, and the man on the street in Beijing was going to demand it. So the idea that they've gotten in front of that seems to me a strikingly good development. One final point. If good economics, the way we've talked about it today, means anything, it means you want to have your transition in your country when the rest of the world is roaring ahead. The Chinese find themselves in an uncomfortable moment. If US economic growth is stuck around 2, the Europeans are trying to grow, if at all, by a 1/10 or 2. They have signed up to do this in a very difficult economic environment. It may be that the tougher the global scenario, the more convinced they are of the need for fundamental reform, the greater conviction they have to get through this period of transition. But if you were designing this on a chalkboard, at least with a bunch of economists, you'd wish you could be doing it at a time that the global economy was frankly stronger than it is today.
That's true. The external economy is not helping. Okay, I don't think we could get a better answer. I'd just like to say that a lot of the remaining agenda today and tomorrow at this Asia Global Dialogue will be devoted to that point. And I'd like to point to the fact that Chairman Liu Ming-kang will in fact be chairing a panel at tomorrow's lunch. Chairman Liu was the former head of the Chinese CBRC, and with a very distinguished panel, will be addressing these issues tomorrow at lunchtime. So with that, I think I can take one more question, maybe on this side of the room, if there's any. And then, okay, back here. Welcome. You have a loud enough voice, you don't need a microphone. No. No, please. All right, that was a joke.
It's because I've known you too long. Robin Meredith from Reorient Group. Just building on what you guys talked about on the panel and what Mike Spence raised as concerns this morning. A lot of us have worried about the effect of globalization on jobs. And the solution we always come to is that we need better, more efficient education and faster economic growth through globalization. And the individuals have to take more responsibility for bettering themselves. And that sounds really great, and I tend to agree with all that, but I'm afraid my recommendation is inadequate as well, because basically what we're saying is that just like in Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, every kid has to be above average in order to succeed, and every kid's not. And the way the economy is describing, as Spence talked about it this morning, we're actually displacing more people from jobs than we are creating new jobs, whether it's with big data or whatever. I don't disagree with the movement or the inevitability of it, but what are we going to do with all those extra people who don't have jobs in a time when US and Europe are not in the mood for greater social spending?
I'll talk about it for a second, because there's been this, I've listened to this debate for a long time, in the US anyway, that said those people, you cannot train those people that were manufacturing folks to do these kinds of jobs. Or these kids that are come from underprivileged environments cannot be educated for these kinds of jobs. So we did two things, myself and two other guys. One is we built our own school in New York called P-Tech. It's a unique school. It's 9 through 14. And you're trained in that school for the 3 million open jobs today in the United States. And if you graduate from that school, you have first right of refusal at IBM or another tech company at $50,000 a year. School's over-enrolled. Now there's like 20 schools like this across the country, and the Obama administration has put another $100 million behind it because the track record is phenomenally successful. One example, let's go to the Midwest. Economic downturn, automotive industry gets tanked. All these people, they say, there's no way you could retrain those people. We said, well, we don't think so. So we opened a center in Columbia, Missouri. We took these people, used the community college system, and we taught them how to do basic tech jobs. And we created 800 jobs in about 15 months, I think. So the point that these things cannot be done, to me, it's because if you think of it in the current system, it can't be done. Right? You can't change the current system, in my opinion, of public education in the United States. So Joe Klein, who was the chancellor of the school system, and Mayor Bloomberg, who was a friend of ours, just built our own school. So the system can't deal with that. This school never existed before. The union doesn't know what to do, right? I mean, so you can. No different than you could take a piece of a mall in Columbia, Missouri, right, and turn it in from a mall into basically an education facility for software development with a little bit of economic development incentive, and take people who lost their jobs in the downturn in the automotive industry and train them for these kinds of things. So I have a kind of an optimistic point of view, which I'd be the first to admit, that there is a way to create these alternatives to prepare these people for the future. The other side of it, which is Kevin's argued on TV, which he's much more articulate than I am, I think it's a great travesty in the sense of what's going on with the stimulus packages, because all it's doing is creating more wealth for the wealthy and leaving everybody else behind, right, as these asset classes inflate. Whereas with a little bit of thought, I think we could have taken the $85 billion a month or whatever it is and maybe opened 5 more schools or created 6 more centers and created maybe, instead of 1,000 jobs, 50,000 jobs in these kinds of areas. But it gets back to a strategy. And that's what I think in many ways has been lacking. Now, I mean, this is kind of a U.S. there's no issue with education as far as math and science in this part of the world. I mean, the test scores, as you know, are off the charts. So this is kind of an issue for the U.S. More so than here, I think.
Okay. Well, Sam, with that, I think that's a very good way to end our luncheon panel. Thank you very much to our panel members. I don't think we could have assembled a better group to be talking to you. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Well done.
Excellent. Great fun. It was great fun. Thanks. Good job, as always, Victor. Keep